This is Al Jazeera.
Hello there, I'm Nastasia Tay, and this is the NewsHour live from our headquarters here in Doha. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. Ethiopia says it's made military gains in the northern Tigray region. Aid agencies warn people there are running out of food and medical supplies. Accusing China of breaking its promise, Britain condemns a new law that disqualifies pro-democracy Hong Kong legislators. The US reports its highest daily death toll from COVID-19 since early May. Health experts warn the pandemic is accelerating. And Jerry Rawlings, the military coup leader who guided Ghana's transition to democracy, has died.
And I'm Peter Stemmert with your sport. Golf's Masters finally tees off after a 7-month delay, and all eyes are on big-hitting Bryson DeChambeau, who is aiming to win back-to-back majors by outdriving his opposition.
Now, Ethiopia's military says it's making gains in the northern Tigray region, where the federal government is battling local forces. This offensive began last week after Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed accused the regional government of attacking a military base. Aid agencies are warning they cannot bring much-needed supplies into the region because of the fighting. Thousands of people have since fled, many of them to neighboring Sudan. Well, Al Jazeera's Hiba Morgan is near Sudan's border with Ethiopia. We'll be speaking to her in just a few minutes. But first, let's go to Mohamed Ado. He's in the capital, Addis Ababa. Mo, we've been hearing that they're making gains, allegedly, the Ethiopian military. But obviously, it's very hard to get information out of the Tigray region, and these are two very well-armed sides. Just what do we know about how this offensive is actually going on the ground?
Well, yes, Nastasia, they're saying they've gained ground in the western part of the country, close to the border with Eritrea, and also on the border Ethiopia has with Sudan. They say they've taken the town of Humera just on Wednesday. They had said they had taken the airport there. Now they've taken the town, which is not far away from the airport. They say they've also taken the towns of Shire and Shiraro, as well as the ancient city of Axum, which has got a lot of historical importance here in Ethiopia. Of course, most of the fighting so far has been concentrated on the western part of the Tigray region, and it has involved clashes between ground troops as well as airstrikes targeting fuel and arms depots, as well as artillery duels, which have caused so much casualties on both sides. The government here in Addis Ababa maintains this operation will not stop until it achieves its objectives of disarming the TPLF militias as well as bringing their leadership to justice.
Well, Mohamed, Abiy's record in office so far would suggest that he really isn't interested in de-escalation, which those statements would also seem to suggest. But various foreign leaders are getting involved. They're offering to mediate. Where do you see this going?
Well, the government here seems set on continuing with this operation. They have been having a situation of no war, no peace for most of the past 2 years. There have been a lot of defiance, they say, from the Tigray leadership, and they say they want to see it get done and dusted with. But again, how that will be done is another matter altogether, because the Tigray Liberation Front is well armed. In some estimates, diplomats say up to 250,000 troops. They have been battle-hardened, not only with the fight against Eritrea, twice actually, and also the fight against the war against Mengistu Haile Mariam, who they knocked off power, and they are very well armed. And if these conflict gets entrenched and gets protracted, many people are fearing for the stability of Ethiopia.
And the whole region. Mohammed Ado there for us in Addis Ababa. Thanks so much, Mohammed. Well, now let's speak to Hiba Morgan. She's joining us live from Gadaref in Sudan, which is right near the Ethiopian border. Hiba, I know you've been traveling all day to get there. Can you give us a sense of what you're seeing, especially in terms of this, what appears to be an unfolding humanitarian crisis on the ground?
Yes, indeed, Nastasia. Now, we've been talking to local aid organizations who are at the border receiving those refugees, and they say that the influx of refugees is quite high. They say that more than 10,000 have arrived over the past 48 hours alone, and those are the ones who have already crossed the border and crossed the river barrier between Sudan and Ethiopia into Sudanese territory. Now, they say hundreds of thousands more are waiting, as per their estimation, across the border, across the Ethiopian border, waiting for means to be able to come into Sudan seeking refuge. They say most of them are women and children, but they also include former combatants, people who have laid down their arms to seek refuge here in Sudanese territory. So what happens upon arrival, they say, is that those refugees are then screened for health reasons, but they're also screened to make sure that they're not armed so that this conflict does not spill over the border. Then comes the issue of settling them into camps. Already there were refugee settlements here in the state of Gadaref as well as the neighboring state of Kassala, where refugees are already arriving. All of them have been saying that they already were in need of humanitarian assistance, that the assistance was already too little, and that with this influx of refugees, which is expected to reach up to 200,000 in the coming few days, the situation will be dire, and that humanitarian organizations here in Sudan and international organizations need to step up to what's unfolding to be a crisis.
Huge numbers there, Hiba. And you and I have been speaking for several days now about how this could potentially destabilize the entire Horn of Africa with conflict spilling over borders. And I know in the area where you're standing, there have been clashes along that border between Ethiopia and Sudan, between various different groups, that some of which support Tigrayan force and some of which don't. Could we see further clashes, do you think?
Well, the border situation between Sudan and Ethiopia have always been very unstable and very volatile. There are parts of the border here between in Gadaref and that's neighboring with Ethiopia that has been disputed upon between the two sides, and which has resulted in officials visiting official visits between the two countries to try to demarcate those borders to end such conflicts. We've seen in February and in May this conflicts unfolding into what turned out to be armed clashes and leading to the death of military officials here in Sudan, military officers as well as Ethiopian soldiers. So there are quite some border tensions, and the border has always been porous to begin with. There were reports of smuggling, there were reports of human trafficking, which is why Sudan, upon the start of this conflict in the Tigray region, announced that it is shutting down its border in Gadaref state and also in Kassala state, and deployed more than 6,000 troops. Now, this comes at a very sensitive time for Sudan, Nastasia. The Prime Minister of Sudan, Abdullah Hamdok, is currently the head of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. That's the East African bloc that brings together various groups of nations here in East Africa, including Ethiopia and Sudan. And he has offered to mediate in this conflict. We've also seen the Security and Defense Committee, that's the committee that's responsible for security issues here in Sudan, holding an extraordinary meeting discussing the issue that is unfolding here at the border. And they've offered to mediate, saying that they're concerned about how this will spill over. But Ethiopia's response so far, as per the envoy that came to Sudan on Tuesday, is that this is unnecessary and that this situation will be dealt with in the shortest time possible.
Hiba Morgan there on the ground for us, very near the Ethiopian border on the Sudanese side of that. We'll be speaking to her a lot in the coming days, monitoring that situation for us. Thank you, Hiba. Well, now the European Union is demanding that China reverse a new rule that's led to 4 Hong Kong legislators being sacked. Opposition politicians in the city have resigned en masse in solidarity. On Wednesday, China passed a law allowing legislators to be barred if they are deemed to pose a national security threat. Now, the UK, which handed the territory to China in 1997, says that move undermines Hong Kong's autonomy and has summoned the Chinese ambassador. The US has also threatened more sanctions against Chinese and Hong Kong officials. Adrian Brown reports from Hong Kong.
Hong Kong's Legislative Assembly was quieter than usual on Thursday, now that almost a quarter of its lawmakers have resigned or been disqualified, and staging what's likely to be their last protest. The Chinese characters say Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam has brought calamity to the territory and its people. She'll stink for 10,000 years. The slogan was displayed by Democratic lawmaker Lam Chuk-ting, who must now give up his office by the end of the month.
I will keep fighting for democracy of Hong Kong. We will never surrender. And we will hand together with all the Hong Kong people and the civil society and to fight against the dictatorship.
This is what China's leaders want to stamp out. Lawmakers behaving badly, with those from the Democratic camp accused of being the main culprits. China's government has condemned the mass resignation of almost all Hong Kong's opposition as a farce, with only themselves to blame for their downfall, says the sole Hong Kong delegate to China's most powerful political body.
What China has been doing is based on the constitution and basic law. Therefore, everything should be done in accordance with the law. We cannot badmouth one country, two systems and the Chinese government.
Analysts say Hong Kong's legislature is set to become little more than a rubber stamp parliament, but dissent outside the chamber will likely continue.
What does this mean? This means continuing instability. You can push it down with the police, you can push it down with arrests, but it will re-emerge.
It is not clear what this all means for elections, supposed to have been held 2 months ago, but now pushed back until September next year because of COVID-19. On Thursday, Chinese officials here in Hong Kong warned that legislators who resign or have been disqualified should not be eligible to stand in that poll. Wednesday's shake-up of Parliament comes just 4 months after China's government imposed a sweeping national security law on the territory that some critics call draconian. And in spite of continuing international criticism, China's leadership remains both confident and defiant. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
Well, there's plenty more ahead for you this news hour, including anger on the streets of Angola. Protesters defy coronavirus restrictions to call for elections. Stuck and waiting for help, emergency crews rush to rescue those left stranded after Typhoon Vamco batters the Philippines. And in sport, we'll tell you why Australia's cricketers will not be wearing their traditional green and gold in their upcoming series. That's all coming up with Peter. Now, Ukraine's president has now been hospitalized after becoming the latest leader to contract COVID-19. Volodymyr Zelensky's spokeswoman told Reuters news agency the decision to go to the hospital was to, quote, accurately isolate and not expose anyone. Well, as countries and governments across Europe struggle to contain a rapidly spreading second wave, the World Health Organization is warning them not to lift restrictions too fast. The agency says that could lead to a major increase in cases. Andrew Simmons reports.
For the UK, it's another landmark in the spread of COVID, and it's causing alarm. More than 50,000 people who tested positive have died. Britain's total of dead is now the highest in Europe. Nearly 600 deaths on Wednesday overtakes figures since May in the first wave.
Every death is a tragedy, and we mourn everybody who's gone, and our feelings are with their families and friends as well. We're not out of the woods yet. It does still require everybody to follow the guidance.
Elsewhere in Europe, the spread is on the increase too. In Italy, where hotels are now being used to cope with an overspill of patients, the number of cases has now passed 1 million. That's despite increased lockdown restrictions such as here in Florence. Spain's number of dead within 24 hours has increased to more than 400. It's the highest since the second wave began. France is now using mobile units to treat non-COVID patients because of demands on its hospitals. Germany as well continues to struggle.
Now we have 2 wards that are pretty much at full capacity and where we are barely able to do our jobs.
Hungary is the latest country to increase its lockdown measures. Its parliament has called a 3-month state of emergency that imposes an overnight national curfew. On the ground, countermeasures in the fight against COVID increase, and the race to introduce vaccination programs is also accelerating. The European Union has signed a contract with Pfizer, which has developed the front-runner vaccine with BioNTech. The EU says it's buying 300 million doses. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera.
Well, now the US has recorded its worst daily death toll from COVID-19 since early May, and health experts are warning that the pandemic there is accelerating. Nearly 2,000 more Americans died on Wednesday, taking the total number of fatalities to 241,800 people. It was also the 9th straight day when the number of new cases topped 100,000, and now Texas has become the first state to record more than 1 million cases. Well, even as the virus surges, political paralysis is dominating Washington, with President Trump refusing to concede defeat to Joe Biden. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett is standing by for us in Washington, D.C. But first, let's go to John Hendren. He's in Wilmington, Delaware, Biden's home state. Now, John, I know that Joe Biden has said that dealing with this pandemic is his priority. So do you think then we should be reading into his choice of Ron Klain, the so-called Ebola czar, as his new chief of staff?
Absolutely. That is probably one of the main reasons Joe Biden picked Ron Klain. Right now, there's a vicious second wave of the COVID-19 virus sweeping across the U.S., and hotspots are everywhere. L.A., Texas, New York, the Midwest. 10.5 million cases, 242,000 dead. Joe Biden has been talking about that nearly every day. Donald Trump has not talked about it in several days. Biden picked Klain, who was a longtime aide of his from as far back as the 1980s, in part because he led the Ebola task force back in the Obama administration. And perhaps one of the reasons Democrats say that we haven't heard more about Ebola is that he did such an effective job in stopping it from becoming an epidemic here in the United States. But the president is not, or the president-elect, I should say, is not getting all of the information. And that's because since the White House has not acknowledged and certified him as the next president of the U.S., he's not getting the presidential daily briefings, the intelligence briefings that would tell him, among other things, how bad the COVID epidemic is across the U.S. and what the future threats might be. There's a Senator Lankford has said, he's a Republican. He said that if Donald Trump doesn't force his administration to certify Joe Biden as the next leader so that he can get those briefings, that Lankford will intervene with the Trump administration and try to get them to respond. Meanwhile, Joe Biden has just been acting as if he is the president-elect, as you might expect. He's been taking congratulatory calls from the leaders of Japan, of Australia, of South Korea, and he's been talking substantive policy on coronavirus and climate change, on the kinds of things that they can do. But he won't have the full picture until he gets those briefings. Interestingly, Kamala Harris is on the Senate Intelligence Committee. She gets a certain measure of intelligence briefings that Joe Biden does not.
John Hendren there for us in Wilmington, Delaware. Thank you so much, John. Well, let's move over to Washington, D.C. now, and our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, meanwhile, as all of this is going on, Trump does appear to be holding fast to his refusal to concede. What's on the cards for him today?
The U.S. president is expected to have meetings with some of his top advisors, as he did yesterday with his top election officials. The U.S. president continuing not to concede, and there is a growing awareness in the United States and even among his counterparts that, in fact, the president may never concede or accept the election results. This is something that, while it wouldn't affect inauguration and a transfer of power, that Donald Trump simply will not ever make that phone call to Joe Biden. Now, in the midst of all of this, the president, while he has been maintaining a low profile, has in fact continued to rail on Twitter about concerns about election integrity as well as irregularities. The feeling is that the reason the U.S. president is taking this position is because he believes that the 72 million people that voted for him, in contrast to the 77 that voted for Joe Biden, that they deserve a fight, if you will. So that is what the president is giving them, even as he starts to explore options for his future, including the potential for a media network, something that he believes might be necessary given the conservative network Fox News in the United States, he believes did not support him in the 2020 contest.
Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett there for us. Thanks so much, Kimberly. Well, let's now dig into this with Rina Shah. She joins me also from Washington, D.C. She's a Republican strategist and also a founder of Republican Women for Biden. Rina, thanks for being back with us here on Al Jazeera. I want to start with your background as a political strategist. What do you think is Trump's grand plan here? Does he genuinely think he can change the result, or is this rather an attempt to construct a narrative ahead of a potential run again in 2024?
I think it's a combination of both. And to be honest, the president in 2016, many sources have said he was not expecting to win. In fact, if you look at the photos of him and Vice President Pence from election night, it's one of my favorite things to look at. I mean, they just looked ashen. They couldn't believe they pulled it off. We do know Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 by something like 3 million. Of course, Joe Biden's lead is far greater this time when you look at the popular vote. And he's really encroaching upon the number, that very number that Donald Trump clinched in the Electoral College, 306. So it's historic. It's a landslide. That's what Trump's advisors were saying back in 2016. And Joe Biden will do the same, it's expected, this time around. Of course, our Electoral College is what complicates this entire scenario. And that's why I say the president, I believe, does partly feel that there may be a chance here. His people have been trying to prolong this for a long time. And they've been very open about it. They've been telling us for weeks that we want to actually see this election go past Election Day, not just because of mail-in ballots, but they want this to be fought in the courts. Another part of me also feels like he's seeing the vote totals in 5 states, and he's seeing them be so great. The numbers for Joe Biden are so large, whether you look at Georgia or Michigan or Nevada or Arizona or Pennsylvania. You see Joe Biden leading by 5 figures, not just a few hundred like it was back in the year 2000 between Bush and Gore. So it's really anyone's guess as to what the president's thinking right now. He may be of mixed mind.
He's often of a mixed mind, it seems. Well, amidst all of this, Rina, Joe Biden seems to be quietly trying to get on with this transition. And a lot of the people that he's naming as part of his review teams, that the experts who are supposed to help with that transition, a lot of them are very familiar faces, not to mention Ron Klain. What do you make of him?
Now, I think Ron Klain is an excellent pick. He is somebody who will be a bulldog, I believe. That's what the White House Chief of Staff position, I believe, requires. Somebody who's going to push back on the president, be something of a jerk, for lack of a better word. But Ron Klain doesn't come to this with what we've seen a lot in President Trump's advisors, a lot of bluster and a lot of chest puffing for nothing. Ron Klain brings a really incredible background to this position, and I don't think there could be anybody better suited for the role, given his previous experience with the Ebola pandemic, containing it here in the U.S., but he was also with Biden many years ago when Biden was a senator from Delaware. So he's somebody that is trusted, somebody who has the right temperament, and certainly a background and experience which relies on fact, truth, honesty.
Rina, I was looking at some of the other names that Joe Biden is putting forward, and as a proponent of women's power in politics, I was thinking you must be heartened to see that this is a very diverse group of people.
No doubt I am. I think that's an incredible thing to do here in the United States in the year 2020, is to acknowledge that women bring just as much to the table as men do. Sure, we haven't been part of the working force as long as American men, but that's for a number of reasons. We've really proven our power. Women delivered this election to Joe Biden, I believe. Women are in all sectors of U.S. life, in all industries. And I think what we will really see is the Biden and Harris administration put that on display. We need the brightest minds at the table, given what we've been suffering for so many months with this pandemic on our shores, lack of a plan from this administration. This administration's pandemic task force, COVID-19 task force, hasn't met in so many weeks. It's shocking to me how they operate. And I think we'll see a very stark contrast with the women coming into this administration as well as the men. But it does give me incredible pleasure to see that Kamala Harris was able to achieve what she achieved. And as she said in one of her speeches, and it was truly incredible to just hear from her tipping her hat to Biden, saying he had the audacity to pick me. And that really means still means something in 2020 America.
Well, Serena, looking at the appointments going forward, I've been wondering, how does President-elect try to decide who to appoint to really key positions if he doesn't actually know who is going to be in charge of the Senate until January because of those runoffs? Is he then having to be conservative about who he thinks he can actually get confirmed?
Well, right now we're seeing President-elect Biden be conservative for other reasons. He's being very measured. And look, he's the same man who we saw run in the Democratic primary. This is the same attitude, the same temperament, very steady hand, which is why I believe so many of us cross party lines for him. I'm a lifelong Republican. I'm still very much what I'd consider a small C conservative. But I can appreciate what Biden brings to the country. And he brings a vast amount of foreign policy experience. He really is no novice to any branch of government. Whether you look at the Senate, he is a beast of the Senate in so many ways, having come from there and having spent so many years there. And when you look at how he's going to enter the Oval Office, it's going to be markedly different than most modern American presidents. Mm-hmm. I believe the last person who's coming in with as much sort of national security, intelligence, foreign policy experience was George H.W. Bush, because Clinton, when he entered, Democrats hadn't really been there since the early 80s. So there was a lot of sort of learning curve. There was a lot of adjusting, getting settled into the Oval Office, even for Trump. And that was very different and unique. For this president-elect, that will not be the case. It's all very familiar to him, and that's what I think is why he might also be a little bit more conservative, not just because the unusual nature of the moment in which President Trump will not concede, but it's that he is very familiar, knows how to pull the levers of government, and is very, again, acquainted, more than acquainted, intimately familiar with all the power players.
Rina Shah there, Republican strategist and founder of Republican Women for Biden. Thanks for being with us again on Al Jazeera, Rina.
Certainly. Thanks for having me.
Now, rival factions in Libya have agreed to hold elections there within 18 months. That deal, agreed in neighboring Tunisia, will also unite Libya's rival administrations into one government. The UN has hailed this deal as a breakthrough and says a transitional government will also be discussed. Both sides signed a ceasefire agreement last month in Geneva. Well, our correspondent Mahmoud Abdul-Wahid is in the capital, Tripoli, and says the next step in the process is naming an interim government.
There have been a lot of names nominated for these positions, but they are controversial names. The current Presidential Council includes 9 members, according to this roadmap announced by Williams yesterday. The new Presidential Council will include only 3 members. And also the government should run the country for 18 months before reaching presidential and parliamentary elections to be based on a constitutional frame. The 75 members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum held currently in Tunisia are due to choose among themselves the members of the newly the to be formed government and presidential council. But also it has to take into consideration the conclusions of the military talks held in Sirte currently by the 5+5 military commission, which is tasked with implementing the Geneva ceasefire agreement, which is entailing the removal of all troops in the disputed areas, especially in Sirte and Al Jufra, and also the withdrawal of foreign fighters and mercenaries from Libya. So both tracks are going simultaneously, and no one can succeed alone.
Well, still ahead here on Al Jazeera. We visit the remote region in Moldova that's caught between Russia and Turkey. And women's golf heads to new and controversial territory with the first professional tournament in Saudi Arabia. Peter will have those details for you in sport.
Hello, the atmosphere has been stirred now. The change of season is upon us, and the lower limit of where it's likely to rain is going southwards towards Bahrain and towards Qatar. But the main rain is Iran, with, of course, the cold northern bit and higher above sea level, we'll see snow, and that's largely in Afghanistan. And although things have changed in the Levant, it's quietened down again. The sun is out for the next couple of days. A brief, strong northerly or northwesterly is likely, so showers seem quite likely during Saturday in Doha, and then the wind eases away. Temperature's not changing much, a bit below 30 this time of the year. Southern Africa is the place to watch now for proper rains. We've got the seasonal rain lying across Angola out towards Tanzania. South of that, well, it rains when it feels like it, when you get fronts coming through. At the moment, the concentration isn't really much further south than Zambia. And it's been very warm recently in most of South Africa. Temperatures back down to normal now, about 26 in Johannesburg. And Cape Town's, you're coming back down from your 30 to about 25. In fact, the forecast for Cape Town takes you even cooler as the breeze picks up and the showers seem likely during Saturday, less so on Sunday. So for most of Southern Africa, south of Botswana, it's still quite dry.
Hello again, I'm Nastasia Tay in Doha. Let's remind you of our top stories here this hour. Ethiopia's military says it's making gains in the northern Tigray region, where the federal government is battling local forces. Thousands have fled to neighboring Sudan, and aid agencies are warning they're unable to bring in supplies. China is facing international criticism for a new rule that's led to the disqualification of 4 opposition legislators in Hong Kong. Both the UK and US say they will consider sanctions. And the US has recorded its worst daily death toll from COVID-19 since early May. Health experts are warning the pandemic there is accelerating. Nearly 2,000 more Americans died on Wednesday. Well, now protesters in Angola calling on the government to resign have been met by tear gas and live ammunition. They say they're fed up with the high cost of living, lack of jobs and corruption, and they want delayed elections held as soon as possible. Sarah Khairat reports.
They marched among homes in the coastal capital Luanda and tried to stop people from defying a government ban on protests. On Angola's Independence Day, what started off with songs and chants to demand better living conditions and a new date for local elections delayed by the pandemic, soon turned into this. Tear gas was used to disperse hundreds of demonstrators. At least 15 people were arrested in Malanje and other cities. In the Angolan capital, a person was shot dead. Protesters shout murderers as police fired live ammunition. Last month, similar protests against rising living costs, high unemployment and corruption turned violent. Amnesty International has called on the Angolan government to respect the right to protest and warned it will document any human rights violations as it monitors the situation closely.
This government represses people. We mustn't stay silent. All the MPLA government has done since 1975 is kill Angolans. They have to leave. We've had enough. There is misery and hunger. People are in a bad situation.
The government are the real thieves and bandits. Everyone knows it. Even babies know it.
A presidential decree prevents the gathering of more than 5 people to prevent the spread of coronavirus, but critics say the government has used it to curb freedom of expression. Angola is the second largest oil producer in Africa, but has been riddled with corruption for decades. President João Lourenço came into power in 2017 on the promise of fighting it, but is losing popularity, with some accusing him of protecting his aides. With one of the worst debt crises in Africa and a pandemic that has further crippled an already weak economy, public anger is growing. Sarah Khairat, Al Jazeera.
Now, Ghana's former president, Jerry Rawlings, has died at the age of 73. The former military leader ruled the country from 1981 to 2001. He led 2 military coups, but went on to guide Ghana's transition to democracy. He resigned from the military back in 1992 and became president under a new constitution. Rawlings is credited with bringing in a long period of political stability to the West African country. Well, let's speak to Michael Amoa. He's a visiting senior fellow at the Firas Lalji Centre for Africa at the London School of Economics, and he joins us now from Kent. Thanks for being with us, Michael. Jerry Rawlings has always been such a huge figure, almost larger than life, it seems, when it comes to African politics, even beyond Ghana. I'd like to start by giving our viewers a sense of the influence he had over the discourse around the continent.
Yes, he had quite a very large influence over the continent. First of all, in Ghana, he ruled for perhaps 21 years. He actually successfully did a coup, handed over to a civilian government, and when he thought that this civilian government wasn't doing too well, did a coup again and moved them out. So that sort of set the tone on the continent. And he actually came at a time, a very, very strong populist figure, at a time when he thought that there was too much corruption from the upper and middle classes. He wanted to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. And so it was very popular amongst the poverty-stricken people. And also, during 1979, when he was actually in power, he actually organized a firing squad and killed 8 military generals, and also organized the killing of 3 high court judges. So he was quite used to being very ruthless and dealing with enemies, but also very, very popular with the poor. And that sort of made him have a very, very large influence over the continent as a whole at a time when some sort of strong leadership was needed on the continent.
Michael, I want to ask you a little bit more about that, because as you say, this is a military man, seized power in 2 coups, but then he really became a champion of democracy. I mean, you also mentioned the firing squads there. He spoke about sacrificing army generals, if I recall correctly. Can you talk us through that seeming contradiction in the way that he approached governing?
Yes, the contradiction. At the time, these military generals, 3 of whom were actually former heads of state, were seen as part of the production process of the corruption which he had inherited and wanted to get rid of. So somehow eliminating these former leaders and 8 generals in that fashion, in his estimation, served as a way of actually telling the population that no longer shall we tolerate this sort of corruption and bad governance anymore. So he wanted to set a very sort of strong tone. There are mixed feelings in the country, obviously, about the elimination by firing squad of these generals, as well as perhaps other killings. But then also, it would appear that he was one of the few heads of state who, after serving 2 terms, 2 presidential terms, decided not to go beyond the 2 terms. And that was at least one good example that he set.
Sure. Michael, you mentioned that he remains very popular amongst the poor. How do you think he'll be remembered on the ground in Ghana?
On the ground, he will be remembered as someone who was quite action-oriented, who basically was able to put a lot of things into motion, a very bold and proactive person, sometimes spoke out of term. He had a nickname called Boom, meaning that he just out of the boom, he would just boom out some words, whether they were nice or not nice. He would say what he would basically say his mind. But he's also going to be remembered as someone who was ruthless. He's going to be remembered as someone who actually brought political stability to Ghana as a whole, because for at least the 21 years that he governed, there was some level of political stability that actually became a foundation for leading Ghana into the 4th Republic in 1992, which brought in the next civilian government. And the 4th Republic has been in place ever since that time.
Well, I'll certainly remember his very booming voice indeed. Michael Amoa there from the London School of Economics. Thanks for being with us and sharing your thoughts with us on Al Jazeera.
Thanks for having me.
Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic and the US election, there's been a flood of information, some of it misleading, some simply wrong. Researchers from the Forum of Information and Democracy call it informational chaos, and they're recommending big changes to the way that online service providers operate. They say firms such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Yahoo should be publicly regulated, and they recommend large fines for companies that are not transparent about the way they moderate, rank, and target content. They're calling for tech firms to operate according to a set of principles based on international human rights law. And they say they should introduce safeguards to stop misleading content spreading around the world. They also say online service providers should introduce opt-in features to stop users receiving mass automated spam. Well, right now we can speak to Christopher Wiley. He is a whistleblower and former employee of that data mining firm, Cambridge Analytica, and he's also a co-author of this report, and he joins us now from London. Thanks for being with us, Christopher. Looking at your report, there is a long list of suggestions here for what social media companies should be doing. I see one of those as fact-checking viral posts. That in itself sounds like it would take a huge amount of resources. How do you even try to start enforcing some of these recommendations?
Well, I think when you look at there are over 200 recommendations in the report, and I think they all sort of work together. So when you look at other sections of the report, one of the sort of unique aspects of some of the ideas that are being proposed is actually creating engineering solutions at the very beginning of product creation so that we create more friction to prevent the viral spread of disinformation in the first place, which would indeed actually reduce the need for any kind of content moderation later down the road. So I think there are sort of many debates and issues around censorship and moderation and all of that. But something that's interesting is that a lot of these problems center around the design and architecture of these platforms. And something that the report calls for is actually more attention on the part of platforms at the beginning of the design process to consider safety, to consider quality before things are released into the public. When you look at social media, it's one of the few areas of industry that has almost no rules to do with safety. If I wanted to release a toaster or a kitchen appliance, I would have to do more due diligence to consider what the potential impact is on consumers than if I were to create Facebook. And so what we're saying is at the very beginning of the design process, these platforms should really consider the potential impact that they would have.
So let me ask you then, misinformation, as we've been saying, has taken on really new levels of importance during the pandemic, for instance. How do you then try to regulate misinformation when it's being spread by a head of state, say?
Well, I think whether it's a head of state or a random person or indeed a propaganda network, if something is manifestly untrue, that is, a potential piece of harmful information that we can see causes actual physical, tangible harm. When you look at, what's happening with the COVID pandemic, there are countless numbers of examples of where people buy into conspiracy theories about whether or not, this virus is true, make decisions that they may not otherwise have made that put themselves and others at risk. And so I think, something that this report does is it really frames a lot of these problems around the notion of safety and harm prevention. That, these platforms do have some element, or rather should have some element of, duty of care towards users, regardless of who is promoting harmful content.
So let me pick you up on something you've said there and alluded to, Christopher, that democratic institutions and public discourse essentially requires that we all somehow agree on what is true. But that seems increasingly not to be the case. Take the US election and the aftermath that we're living through right now, for example.
Right, but a lot of the reason why we have sort of this fractured discourse is indeed because of these platforms. So, this sort of trend towards a, postmodern hyperreality where anything can be true just if you want it to be true, a lot of that stems from the fact that these platforms are allowing and curating content that is manifestly untrue and provably untrue. And so, even if, we are getting into discussions about, this may be true for one person and another, there are certain facts, about what's happening right now, particularly when you look at the pandemic. The virus is real. There are certain things that I think we can all agree on. And if we go down the road of, such subjectivity that we can't even agree that there is an underlying truth, then, it really calls into question whether we can have a functioning democracy. We need to at least agree on certain things, certain facts in order to have a functioning debate.
Indeed, some very, very big questions there. Christopher Wiley, a former whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica and also co-author of this report. Thanks for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Really great to get your thoughts, Christopher.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Now, tensions are growing between Russia and Turkey over an autonomous region of Moldova. Gagauzia was once part of the Soviet Union, and Russia maintains a strong influence there. But Turkey also wants to exert its influence and has been helping to finance development projects. Sonia Gallego went there to meet people caught in the middle of this regional tug-of-war.
Anastatova is extremely proud of her heritage. She shows us around her house, designed to give visitors a taste of Gagauz culture. And she tells us why preserving it is so important to her.
I want to preserve the heirlooms of my family left behind. It's so important to pass on our traditions, our folklore, our songs to our children, so they can remember how our ancestors lived.
There are 150,000 Gagauz in Moldova. That's almost 5% of the population. They are ethnically Turkic. Their language is also closer to Turkish than any other in the region. But they are also Orthodox Christians and strongly pro-Russian. A hangover from the days when it was an autonomous region within the Soviet Union. It even claimed its independence as a pro-Soviet republic when Moldova broke away from the USSR. Even today, Gagauzia prefers to keep closer relations with Moscow, unlike the central government in Chisinau, which has been seeking closer ties with the European Union.
Russia's influence is still strongly felt here. Its language and culture dominate in Gagauzia, as do its politics. But there is another regional power starting to make its mark here: Turkey.
In recent years, Turkey has also been investing in this corner of Moldova. From infrastructure to hospitals and schools, it has even been funding lessons in the Gagauz language so it doesn't become extinct here. One way of encouraging ties between its peoples. Whereas Russia continues to focus on the politics.
Pillar of soft power, it's political technologies and providing assistance for candidates and political parties during the elections and between the elections. This is what Russia does.
While Turkey and Russia continue to vie for influence in the Caucasus and the Middle East, Gagauzia's governor says that cooperation here between Moscow, Ankara and the EU could offer another way of conducting diplomacy in the region.
We are in a unique situation. Our territory has welcomed the West, East and other different partners who put in a lot of effort to develop our autonomy. It brings huge advantages to our country. If there are economically strong, stable regions, it drives better development.
This is a region that historically has been caught between great powers. For Anna, success will come down to which of the competing influences will not only preserve this unique region, but also bring it prosperity. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, Gagauzia, Moldova.
Now, rescue efforts are underway in the Philippines after parts of the north were hit by Typhoon Vamco. At least 13 people have died, 20 are injured, and several others are still reported missing. That storm triggered landslides and flooding, including in the capital, Manila. Thousands of people have been evacuated from their homes. Well, still ahead here in sport. Take a look. These Formula One drivers take a spin around Istanbul ahead of the Turkish Grand Prix. Well, it is now time for sport, and here's Peter.
Nastasia, thank you so much. The Masters golf tournament teed off earlier, but in true 2020 fashion, play was almost immediately suspended because of bad weather. This was the gloomy scene very early in the morning at Augusta National in Georgia. Former champions Jack Nicklaus and Gary Player were the honorary starters to get things going, but since then it's got very wet and play was delayed for 3 hours. But it's just restarted. It's been 19 months since Tiger Woods won the last edition of the tournament. The coronavirus pandemic meant it had to be shifted from its usual spot in April to November, and there are no fans this year either. All eyes are on Bryson DeChambeau this week and how far he's hitting the ball. He's looking for back-to-back majors after winning the US Open in September. But one of his rivals, Rory McIlroy, says it's not all about distance at Augusta.
You need to back that up with all other aspects of your game. So, you know, if trophies were handed out just for how far you hit it and how much ball speed you have, then, you know, then I'd be worried. But that's, you know, there's still a lot of, you know, different aspects that you need to master in this game.
Meanwhile, the Ladies European Tour is about to enter new and controversial territory. Its latest event takes place in Saudi Arabia, the first of two professional women's golf tournaments being held in the kingdom for the first time start today. Solheim Cup players Georgia Hall and Charlie Hull are among those who will tee it up at the Royal Greens Golf Club on the Red Sea coast. The two events will have a combined purse of $1.5 million. Moroccan player Maha Hadiwi is the first and only Arab woman on the tour, and she says the focus should be on the positive changes being made for women in Saudi Arabia.
It's really something I'm proud of, and I'm really proud to represent my region, and that, you know, Saudi is making the step forward. It's a big tournament. It's a big statement. As we know, women's golf is sometimes not getting the recognition it should, and we just see it in terms of prize money. And having Saudi put up such a big prize fund in 2 tournaments in a row is a huge statement to make that, you know, to close that gap between men and women's golf.
But the tournament has been criticised by human rights campaigners. 19 organisations published a joint letter calling on players to reconsider their participation because of abuses against women taking place in Saudi Arabia. Ines Osman is the director of MENA Rights Group.
Tournament is that players and organizers are actively participating to a PR sports washing exercise by the authorities. So obviously this golf tournament is not the first and will not be the last sports event being held in the country. But what makes it somewhat special is that it's a women's only event. And at this stage, it's no longer a secret that Saudi women are considered second-class citizens. It is no longer a secret that 5 women's rights defenders are currently in prison for demanding gender equality. And so it's quite hypocritical to have a women's only event in the current context. The motto of the ladies golf tournament is ladies first. And really in a country where ladies do not come first, it is a quite hypocritical way to present this event. I think it's also quite well known that a lot of these sports events also involve a lot of money, and I know that in relation to previous like football cups and events that were held in Saudi last year, it seems that the Public Investment Fund invested billions into these events, and ultimately it seems that the reason why people came is basically for money. So I guess at the end of the day, for some of these players, money comes first and human rights second.
Motorsport's women-only W Series is linking up with Formula One from next season. The series, which launched in 2019, will get 8 support races at Grand Prix weekends. It uses the same 1.8-litre cars as in Formula 3, and drivers will be eligible for points towards an FIA super license needed to race in Formula 1. Meanwhile, F1 is in Istanbul this week for the first Turkish Grand Prix since 2011. 2 of the drivers, Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly, drove over the Bosphorus Bridge connecting Europe and Asia, and then took their cars for a spin around the city streets. Tokyo Olympics organisers say athletes taking part will not have to isolate for 14 days on arrival in Japan, but a decision about international fans is not expected until next year. The head of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, will visit Tokyo next week to discuss coronavirus measures.
There are many foreign fans, and having them quarantined for 2 weeks and not use public transport is unrealistic. Therefore, health checks before entering the country, screening upon arrival, checking their whereabouts after they leave, and responding quickly if they get infected is something that we need to look very carefully at.
Croatia's football team has confirmed that one of their stars played half of their friendly against Turkey with COVID-19. Defender Domagoj Vida, who was captaining the team, only found out about his positive test at half-time in Istanbul, despite having tested negative just 2 days before. He was substituted off and put in isolation. The rest of the team will also isolate before heading to Sweden for their Nations League match. After resigning as the head of English football, Greg Clark has now quit his role as FIFA vice president. He was forced out of his job at the FA because of inappropriate comments he made about racism during a British government hearing. England manager Gareth Southgate agrees he had to go.
The terminology he used in a number of areas was not acceptable and doesn't reflect the view of the FA, doesn't reflect what we as a team stand for. I don't think he had any alternative but to take the decision he did to resign.
Australia's cricket team has a new kit for their upcoming T20 series against India, and it's not the usual green and gold. They've unveiled a special jersey featuring Indigenous art. It's aimed at recognising the contribution of Indigenous Australians in cricket. The women's team also wore an Indigenous jersey in a match against England earlier this year. That's where we'll leave it for now. More sports news again a little later.
I rather like that new kit. Thanks so much, Peter. Well, that is it for this news hour, but don't go away. I will be back in just a moment with another roundup of the day's news. Do stay with us here on Al Jazeera.